Hello and welcome to the Progress Report training for Grants to Indian Tribal Governments program. The reporting periods for the progress reports are January to June and July to December. The January to June report is due July 30th, 30 days after the reporting period ends, and the July to December report is due January 30th, again 30 days after the reporting period ends. Before we begin going through the progress reporting form, I first want to thank you for accepting our recording. We hope that this training enables you to provide the most detailed and accurate reporting of your grant-funded work on your semi-annual progress report. Accurate data reporting is important for many reasons. Your quantitative and qualitative data enable VAWA's effectiveness to be measured. VAWA MEI creates reports for OVW using your data and data from grantees across the country. These summary data reports support OVW to make requests for increased appropriations and to defend VAWA's funding to decision makers. Your data also helps OVW to make sure federal funds are being spent appropriately and to measure the performance of grant programs. Additionally, every 2 years, the Attorney General is required to submit a report to Congress on the overall effectiveness of VAWA funding. VAWA grantee data makes up a significant part of that mandated report. The more consistently grantees fill out their reports, the more accurately VAWA's effectiveness can be measured through these means. Before we go through the reporting form, I first want to share some tips for successful data reporting. The first is to read the separate instructions. So when you access your progress reporting form in GMS, there are also instructions there you can download. They are also available on our website, and that website will be on the last page of this presentation. There are many helpful examples that can assist you in fill out the reporting form. Next, throughout the reporting form, there are other categories in many questions. In general, we ask that you use the other category only if no close fit exists. Oftentimes, when we aggregate data for reports, the other categories are not included. Therefore, if there is a close fit and you can include your information in one of the existing categories, your information will be included in those reports. However, we do understand that there are scenarios where the other category really is only the correct fit for whatever it is you're trying to report. In that case, definitely use the other category. We just ask that you rule out all the other options first. Another tip, use optional information questions to discuss successes and or provide more detail. At the end of each section, these optional information questions are narrative boxes where you can further describe the data you reported, or maybe you want to talk about a really successful event you had. Here's where you can do that, and this really helps your data and your grant work come alive, both for us as reviewers and for OVW. Additionally, we ask that you do not use acronyms or abbreviations. If you have a long title of an organization or something that's popping up frequently that you'd like to use an acronym or abbreviation, we ask that you spell it out at least once in your report, and therefore we'll be able to reference that as we read your material. Otherwise, we do our best to guess what some acronyms or abbreviations mean, but we're not always 100% correct. This way you can ensure that we fully understand what you're reporting. Next, do not include attachments or extra documents as a way to report data. When we receive the data from the GMS system, the only information we receive is what's included in your progress report form. So if you have an attachment with additional data that you're hoping for us to see, unfortunately, we're never going to get that. So if there's any information that you would like to include, we ask that you include it in one of the narrative questions, and that way we'll be able to see it. Otherwise, it will never come across our desk. Finally, give us a call or send us an email. We're here to help. So if anything from today's training was confusing and you want a little more information, or you have a specific scenario that you'd like to have a discussion about, by all means, send us an email, give us a call. We're here to help you. Okay, let's begin. Section A1 grant information. Section A1 must be completed by all grantees. This is the information that details your organization. For question 1 is the date of report. This is the date that you submit your report in the GMS system. Questions 2 through 4 will be pre-populated, so the correct reporting period will be checked and the year will appear. Usually all this information in questions 2 through 4 is correct, but it's worth giving it a glance just to make sure you have the right report. Question 5 looks at point of contact. So this person is responsible for the day-to-day coordination of the grant. Sometimes we see the fiscal manager or maybe the director of operations put in here, and unfortunately when we call that individual, they do not know the ins and outs of the grant-funded work. Therefore, we ask that you put someone here, maybe the program coordinator, maybe there's a support staff person who really understands the work. We ask you to put their name and information here because that is who we're going to reach out to if we have any questions about your data or need any clarification. Question 6 looks at what tribal populations are served by this grant. We ask that you please detail all of the specific tribal populations instead of responses like all the tribes in our state or all the tribes in our area. Unfortunately, we do not have the information about what tribes are in your state, so if you can detail that here, that would be very helpful. If you run out of room, just note that in question 6 and you can continue the list in the later narrative questions. Question 7 looks at what percentage of your tribal government program funds were directed to each of the areas, so sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. This information is up to you and will change each period. Grantees often base their percentages on the types of victim survivors they're serving, the training material or community education content that they're providing. So again, this is up to you, and it can change each reporting period based on how your funds are using. The only thing that should stay the same is that the total must equal 100%. Moving on to section A2, staff information. If you use your tribal government program funds for staff positions, you're going to check yes and then fill out this section. If not, you'll check no and skip to section B. Let me scroll down for a moment so I can try to get all of the staff categories in there. So we're going to use a few examples to really look at how to report staff. Before we do that, I have just a couple tips for you. So when considering reporting staff, you're going to report staff if funded by grant funds. Here you will not include any staff that are not grant funded. This report is looking just at the use of grant funds, so that's going to apply across the entire report. The next tip, report by activity performed rather than job title. So for instance, if you have a program coordinator that is doing program coordination but also doing victim advocacy work, you're going to split their grant-funded staff time between those two categories because these categories are looking at activity performed. Tip number 3, time should be prorated if necessary. So this may be the case that somebody is only partially grant-funded or maybe worked only a few months out of the 6-month reporting period. We have some examples that we'll look at that will include that for rating. Tip number 4, report to the second decimal. Sometimes we see grantees report percentages here. Instead, you're reporting decimals, and 1.00 FTE being a full-time 40-hour position for the 6-month period. We'll get more into that on the next slide. And then finally, as we mentioned before, we ask that you use the other categories sparingly. When you're thinking about the staff person you're looking to report, look at those activities and include their FTEs in the most appropriate fit. Again, if that doesn't exist, then by all means use the other category and you can detail that staff person's functions in a later narrative question. So here's what we call our cheat sheet for calculating FTEs. Calculations are based on 40 hours a week for 26 weeks, or 1,040 working hours in a 6-month reporting period. If you look on this slide, you'll see a couple of examples. So for instance, 0.50 FTEs would be someone working 20 hours a week, which is 520 hours in a 6-month period. That could go all the way down to 0.10, 4 hours a week, which is 104 hours for a 6-month period. If you're tracking how many hours an employee is being grant funded to work in a 6-month period, 1040 is your golden number that you're going to divide by to get the FTE for that staff person. Before we go into some examples, let's first look at some FTEs to sections of the report. So this form, as you know, has many sections, and you're only filling out the sections that are related to grant-funded activities and the work of your grant-funded staff. If we see your legal services subsection filled out, we're expecting to see an attorney or paralegal FTE. If your supervised visitation section is filled out, we're expecting to see supervised visitation staff or monitor FTEs. For law enforcement, we're looking to see the law enforcement officer FTE is filled out. Prosecution section, we're looking for prosecutor FTEs. The court section, we'd be looking for court personnel or judge FTEs. And the probation section, we're looking for probation officer FTEs. Oftentimes, we'll see these subsections filled out, but no staff FTEs reported. That is an instance where we would reach out to your program to find out if those sections were filled out and there's missing FTEs, or it may be that those sections were filled out, but grant funds were not actually going towards that work. So this slide can help you make sure that you are filling out the right sections based on the staffing that your grant funds are providing. Okay, let's go into some examples. The first example, your grant funds are used to fund one full-time victim advocate whose salary is 60% funded by the grant, and then another full-time victim advocate whose salary is 35% funded by the grant. In this case, you report only the percent of salary that is grant funded, so the correct FTE under victim advocate is 0.95 FTE. So that's that 60% and 35%, which are 0.60 and 0.35 FTEs. So if you look on the GMS, you'll see 0.95 under the victim advocate category. The next example, example 2. Your grant funds a full-time employee who've spent 16 hours a week coordinating the program and 24 hours a week training professionals in the field and holding community education events. In this case, you would divide their staff time by the functions they're doing. So under program coordinator, you would put 0.40 FTE, and that's 16 hours divided by 40 hours, and then 0.60 FTE, 24 hours divided by 40 hours, and that would be under trainer educator. So even if this grant-funded staff person was called the program coordinator, because they are spending a lot of their time being a trainer or educator, you are including an FTE under that particular activity as well as the program coordinator activity. So if you look on the GMS, you'll see 0.40 under program coordinator and 0.60 under trainer educator for that staff person's split time between those two job functions. Example 3. During the 6-month reporting period, your program used tribal government's program funds to pay overtime for tribal officers in the domestic violence unit, and now you need to convert this time into FTEs. Over 6 months, you paid 15 hours of overtime per week for the officers. So in this example, you're going to take the 15 hours and multiply by the 26 weeks, which gives you a total of 390 overtime hours that were paid for with grant funds. Then you're going to divide the 390 by 1040, and that's going to give you the 0.38 FTE, which you'll see under the law enforcement line on the GMS. Moving on, Section B, Purpose Areas. All grantees must complete this subsection. If you do not, the form will not be able to validate. So for purpose areas, you should check all that apply to activities engaged in with your tribal government funds during the current reporting period. If you're not sure which purpose areas apply to your grant program, you should refer to your grant proposal. If some of your purpose areas have changed, you can check them in this question. We do advise that your program specialist must approve all changes to your purpose areas. The next section is section C1, training. Here, if you've used tribal government program funds for training activities, you'll check yes and continue to fill out this section. If not, you're going to check no, and you'll skip to subsection C2. Here are some tips for training. Training is defined as activities for professionals or volunteers acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victim survivors as it relates to their role in the system. You're going to complete this section if you're providing training to professionals. Sometimes you see grantees reporting education of non-professionals in this section. That will be included in the education section, which we'll go over shortly. The one big takeaway to think about with training is that for the purposes of this form, training means providing information to professionals. One tip we have, do not count staff development of grant-funded staff in this section. So if you are a grant-funded staff person and grant funds support you to attend a conference, you would not be included in this section. Instead, training in this section looks at trainings that you have held using grant funds or your grant-funded staff people have provided, or grant funds that have been used to send a non-grant funded staff person or professional in the community to a training elsewhere. So we're going to go into an example to look at this a little further. So for grant funds supported 10 training events for professionals this reporting period, 3 training events provided by other funds also took place. 135 tribal and 85 non-tribal professionals attended the grant-funded training events. 45 professionals attended training events provided by other funds. So looking at the GMS form, you'll see question 10 looks at number of training events. The correct answer for this scenario is 10, because 10 of the 13 training events were provided using grant funds. The 3 trainings that were provided by other funds would not be included because the form is only looking at grant-funded training events. Question 11 looks at number of people trained. So here you're going to include all of the professionals trained in those 10 training events. It's a very long list, but as you'll see as I'm scrolling, that the 135 tribal and 85 non-tribal professionals were included for those 10 training events. However, the 45 professionals that attended the events by other funding sources were not included because it was not a grant-funded training event. And as you see, as I scroll back to the top, for the second column, tribal, that's where you'll include the tribal professionals trained, and the third column is labeled non-tribal. That's where your non-tribal professionals will be trained. You determine. Before you move on, I just want to look at question 12. This is training content areas. So these are check boxes. Here you will check off any of the training content that was covered in any of those grant-funded training events. And then finally, question 13 is one of those optional additional information questions where you can use this space to describe the effectiveness of your training activities, or maybe you completed an evaluation of your training and you want to include those results here. It's up to you. Again, we encourage you to fill this out because it provides more information about your grant-funded work that the data maybe cannot capture on its own. Section C2 looks at community education. If you used your tribal government program funds for community education, you'll fill out this section. If not, you will press no and skip to subsection C3. Education is defined as providing general information that will increase public awareness of sexual assault and domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So as we mentioned before, here is where you're going to capture the non-professionals that you're engaging in your community, whether that be students, community members, community businesses. This is who we will want to see in community education. Again, training is for professionals that you're working with in your community. So let's go through an example so we can work through this section. Grant funds supported 3 community education events and 2 presentations at a local high school. 475 various community members were reached at community events, and 260 students and 60 educators were reached through the school presentations. So in this case, grant funds supported all of the above activities. Therefore, you're going to include all 795 people educated in question 14. So if you look at question 14 on the GMS, you'll see the 475 community members, the 60 teachers, and 260 students, all totaling the 795. The form does total on its own, so when you add the appropriate numbers in the existing categories, the total will change as you include more people. Question 15 looks at topics of the education event. So just like in training, you're going to check off any of the areas that you covered in your education event. And scrolling down, question 16 looks at outreach activities. So here, you'll indicate the number of outreach activities supported with tribal government program funds. And so this is not a checkbox. Here, you're going to include actual numbers. So if you had 4 educational exhibits, you'll include that here. Remember, these are activities that are provided with your tribal government grant funds. If you're doing other outreach activities with other funds, you would not include those here. Section C3, Coordinated Community Response. This is another section that must be completed by all grantees, otherwise the form will not validate. This section first asks, are you an Indian Victim Services Provider organization? You'll click yes or no. And then are you a tribal coalition? Again, you're going to click yes or no. So the Coordinated Community Response, CCR, provides a picture of the relationship that you have with other agencies and organizations within your community and the frequency with which you interact with these agencies and organizations. So if you look at the GMS, you'll see in the first column the agencies or groups. It's a pretty extensive list and goes to the next page. Here, you will go through the list and identify the agencies or groups that you are engaging, whether that's your grant-funded staff people attending meetings with these individuals or your grant funders supporting these relationships. Really, it's the scope of work of your grant funding. In the next set of 3 boxes, so kind of the second column, you'll see it titled Victim Survivor Referrals, Consultations, Technical Assistance. So you will check off whether those were provided daily, weekly, or monthly. We know that it's not a perfect fit, so just get as close as possible. So if you are meeting with an organization or you're referring victim survivors to an organization or they're being referred to you on almost a daily basis, we'd encourage you to check off daily. Likewise, if you are only referring somewhere or receiving a referral from an organization once a month or maybe 2 times a month, that's closer to monthly than weekly. So just use your best guess based on the frequency. The next column, the third column in the 3 sets of boxes, are looking at meetings you have with these agencies or groups. And the options here are weekly, monthly, quarterly. Again, we suggest that you choose the closest fit and to go with the most frequent contact. So what I mean by that is if you, for instance, are meeting with 2 different nonprofits, so nonprofit, non-governmental Indian Victim Service Programs, and one of them you meet with weekly and the other one you meet with monthly. There's only one row for that type of agency. Because you're meeting with one of them weekly, check that box off rather than monthly to indicate that more frequent contact you're having, even if you're not having as frequent contact with the other nonprofit, non-governmental Indian Victim Services program. And then finally, the last column is where you're going to check off any of the agencies or groups that are collaborative partners. Question 18 is an optional additional information question. So here you can discuss the effectiveness of your CCR activities that are supported or funded by your tribal government program grants and provide more detail about those activities. Section C4 looks at policies. So if you use your tribal government program funds to develop, substantially revise, or implement policies or protocols during the current reporting period, you will check yes. If not, you'll move on to subsection C5. Here, if you look at 19, is a checklist. So if you have developed, revised, or implemented policies during this reporting period that you're reporting for, you're going to check all that apply. By substantially revised, we mean that you spent a good amount of time revising the policy or protocol. Simply adding the name of another group under your underserved populations policy would not constitute a revision unless separate protocols around how to serve the new group are included. If the policy or protocol is still in the development or revision phase, you should not report the policy or protocol implemented until the period when it is actually finished. That way you will keep from over-reporting the completion of policies. Just scrolling through the various categories here. Again, you'll click the checkboxes for the applicable sections. And then here is another optional additional information. Question 20. Here you could further discuss the effectiveness of your policies or provide further explanation of what your policy changes were or who you're working with on those. Something that the checkboxes would not be able to do on their own. Section C5 looks at products and codes. So again, if you're using your tribal government's program funds to create products and codes, then you will press yes and then continue to fill out the section. If not, you'll skip to subsection C6 and hit no. So when you're thinking about reporting a product, so we're going to use brochures as an example, the first thing you report is the number developed or revised. So here, you're thinking about the product in and of itself. If you have created one new brochure, you're going to put 1 here. Next is the title or topic of that brochure, and then the intended audience, whether that be service providers, victims, survivors, or community members. Finally, you're going to report number used or distributed. In this example, 195 of these brochures were distributed. In the case that you use grant funds to, say, print 500 of these brochures, we wouldn't want to see the 500 reported here. You're not reporting what was printed. Instead, it's the 195 that were given out at training events or were taken from your offices. And then finally, you would report other languages in that final column. It is possible that you will have developed or revised a product but have not used or distributed it that reporting period, and vice versa. It may have been already developed or revised and then instead only distributed or used in that reporting period. So we do not expect to always see both number developed or revised filled out as well as number used or distributed. It is possible that you either just revised a product in that period or you just distributed an already existing product. Section C6 looks at data collection and communication systems. Again, if you use your tribal government program funds for these activities, you'll click yes and continue to fill out the section. If not, hit no and skip to subsection C7. This is, again, a list of check boxes. Question 22 looks at use of tribal government program funds for data collection and or communication systems. You'll check all that apply. Question 23 looks at purpose of data collection and or communication systems. So here you'll indicate the type of information being identified or tracked with the technologies that you're implementing. Section C7 looks at system improvement. So if you're using tribal government's grant funds for system improvement, click yes and fill out this section. If not, move on to Section D. So for question 24, indicate the system improvement activities engaged in during the current reporting period with your tribal government program funds and identify the systems in which the improvement occurred. So for 24, you'll check all that apply, and as you see across the top, it has the particular areas, so victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, court, probation or parole, offender monitoring. Section D, victim services. So the victim service section is broken into sections D1 and D2. And D1 is looking at victim services. D2 then looks at transitional housing services, and then legal services. So before we begin looking at victim services, there are a couple of tips I want to share with you. Most of the data requested in the victim services section is congressionally mandated. So Congress wants to know how many of the number of victim survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. You're going to provide information in this section that represents only those victim survivors served and services provided with tribal government program funding. If you are using separate funding for victim services, you would not fill this out. Again, this form is looking at your grant-funded activities and services that were provided. So when reporting victim survivors, what should you consider? First, ask yourself, what services did the victim request or accept? The victim survivor has to request or accept services before you would count them in this section. What services are you funded to provide under your grant? Only report on the grant-funded requested services you provide, not services you provide with other funding. The next question to ask yourself, is the person a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking? Victims must be a primary victim of one of these victimizations to be served using grant funds. Let's look at who is not counted at all. So those seeking only services not funded with their tribal government program grant. So if a victim survivor comes in requesting non-grant funded services, you're not going to count them here, whether you provided them or not, because it's not a grant-funded service, they are not included in this report. You're not going to count those who did not accept any of the grant-funded services that were offered or recommended. Remember, you count an individual once they request or accept a service. If you've offered them grant-funded services, it's their right to refuse those services, and you would not count them here. Sometimes grantees report these victims as not served because, yes, you're correct, they weren't served. However, for the purposes of this grant, not served is reserved for those victim survivors who requested grant-funded services and were unable to be provided those services. Finally, those who are not primary victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking. To be served with these grant funds, you must be a primary victim of one of the 4 crimes. So if they are not a primary victim, you will not be counting them here. So let's look at question 25. So in 25, you're going to report the number of victim survivors served, partially served, or not served who are seeking victim services. Served is defined as receiving all requested services that are provided by tribal government funds. Partially served, the victim survivor received some but not all of the requested services that are provided by tribal government funds. And then not served, received none of the requested services that are provided by tribal government funds. So these definitions seem pretty straightforward, but they do get tricky, so we will work with these in our examples. One thing we like to remind grantees is that victims reported are an unduplicated count, and they should be counted only once per reporting period. However, they can be counted in each reporting period they are served. So for example, a victim requested counseling at the beginning of the reporting period, then they also came back at the end of the reporting period and requested civil legal advocacy. They should be reported only once in question 25 because you provided them services that reporting period, and then they should be counted once under each of the type of service provided in question 30A, which looks at the victim services. Victims need to be reported under their primary victimization, even if the victim has experienced more than one type of victimization. So looking at question 25, you see their sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. To keep an unduplicated count of victim survivors, you will choose a primary victimization. So for example, a victim's estranged intimate partner who had a history of very controlling behavior came to her apartment and sexually assaulted her. She came to your agency looking for help with a protection order. You could report the victim under DV or SA, but you must choose only one. The SA category may be more appropriate in this case because it was a sexual assault that prompted her to seek services. Before we go into these examples, I just want to orient you to the form a little bit. So question 25 that we've been looking at is where you're counting served, partially served, and not served victim survivors under the sexual assault, DV, and stalking categories. This table does total on its own, so as you include victim survivors here, the totals will update. Looking at 26, here are the reasons that victim survivors seeking services were not served or were partially served. So in 25, if you indicate a victim survivor or a group of victim survivors who were not served or partially served, the form is going to ask you to check off the reasons why. So here you'll check all that apply, and if one reason applies to more than one victim survivor, that's okay. It will just be a checkbox, and that will cover all of those victim survivors for that reason. 27 looks at demographics of victim survivors. So here, you're going to report the race, ethnicity, gender, age, and other demographics. For race, ethnicity, the total must be equal to or greater than the sum of 25A and 25B. So you can report a victim survivor under any race, ethnicity they identify. We do ask that you report them only once under that particular race, ethnicity. For gender and for age, you must report a victim survivor only once. So the total should equal the sum of 25A and 25B. So the total of served and partially served victim survivors. And then finally, for other demographics, these are things that you learn about incidentally. You would never ask somebody about their English proficiency or if they have a disability. It's just that as you were working with them, this may be something that you happen to find out. Oftentimes, the other demographics are much lower than the victim survivor total for the section, and that's okay. That's to be expected. That's because you're not directly asking anybody about these other demographics. Section 28 looks at victim survivors' relationship to offenders by victimization. So for each victim reported as served and partially served, report their relationship to offender. If a victim experienced more than one type of victimization and or was victimized by more than one perpetrator, count that victim in all categories that apply. So for the earlier example of the victim who was experiencing domestic violence and sexual assault, you would be able to report them once under sexual assault and domestic violence for the current or former spouse or intimate partner category. Question 29 looks at number of services provided to children of victims. So here you'll report the number of children in the first box and then the number of times service was provided. We expect the number of times service provided to be equal to or higher than the number of children. That's because if you had 30 children reported that were served, then there would be at least 30 times of service because each reported child will have received at least one service. Question 30A looks at the victim services provided to the victim survivors that are reported in question 25. So like the children question, in the first box for each category, you'll report the number of victim survivors and then the number of times service was provided. So if you were providing somebody counseling support and they attended 6 sessions in the reporting period, you'll report 1 for victim survivor and then 6 for the number of times service was provided. Again, we expect the number of times service provided box to be equal to or greater than the number of victim survivors that are reported in that first box. Additionally, a victim survivor is only reported once in each service category, no matter how many times the service was provided. So if you have served 50 total victim survivors, then we expect to see 50 or less victim survivors in each service category. I believe the form will alert you if you report more victim survivors in the services than victim survivors being provided services in question 25. Question 30A, victim services. Based on the victim survivors reported in question 25A and 25B, report the number of victim survivors who received tribal government program-funded services during the current reporting period. Count each victim survivor only once for each type of service that they received during the current reporting period under the number of victim survivors column. Next, you'll count the number of times the service was provided to those victim survivors. So just like with the children question, if there are 30 victim survivors who receive civil legal advocacy, we expect to see at least 30 reported in number of times service was provided because they will be provided that service at least once. Question 30D looks at hotline calls. So here you'll report the number of crisis information referral calls received on phone nights paid with for tribal government program funds or answered by tribal government program funded staff during the current reporting period. 30C looks at victim witness notification or outreach to victim survivors. So here you'll report the number of unsolicited letters, phone calls, or visits to victim survivors. And then 31 looks at protection orders. Here you report the total number of temporary and or final protection orders requested and granted. They should only be reported if tribal government program funded victim service staff provided assistance to victim survivors. Let's bring us back to the top and go through some examples. This is the trickiest section on the form. Example 1. A victim of sexual assault calls your program looking for crisis intervention and group support. Both are funded by your tribal government's grant. You provide her with crisis intervention and she attends a weekly support group. In this case, the victim received all services she requested that you are funded to provide under your grant. Therefore, she will be reported as served under sexual assault column in question 25, and then her demographic information and the services provided would be filled in the rest of the form. Example 2. Your program offers crisis intervention and transportation under your tribal government's grant. A victim of domestic violence asks for these 2 services, but your program can only provide crisis intervention because the advocate is busy and unable to provide transportation. In this case, the victim receives some, but not all requested services that are funded by your tribal government's grant. Therefore, they are reported as partially served under the DV dating violence column in question 25. Then their partial served status is explained by selecting a reason in question 26. If you scroll down to 26, you see program unable to provide service due to limited resources priority setting has been checked off because of this victim survivor being partially served. Finally, example 3. A woman is sexually assaulted and a police officer who responded to the incident has called your program's hotline on behalf of the victim asking for an advocate to to accompany her to the hospital during her examination. There is no advocate available to do this, and it is a service funded by your tribal government grant. In this case, your program is unable to provide the grant-funded service that was requested. Thus, the victim should be reported as not served under the sexual assault column in 25, and then explained by selecting a reason in question 26. For this victim survivor, you will not see any of the demographic information filled out or the services because they were not provided services. And all of the following questions after 25 are related to the served and partially served victim survivors. The next section of the victim services section, which looks at shelter and transitional housing assistance. Just like any of the other sections of this grant, you're only reporting in this section if your tribal government grant funds were used to provide shelter or transitional housing services. If you look at question 32, shelter and transitional housing services, you'll see that you're reporting both victim survivors and the family members who received emergency shelter or transitional housing. You'll also see that you're reporting the number of bed nights for those victim survivors and family members. And if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see that this number is determined by taking the number of victim survivors and number of family members and multiplying it by the number of nights in shelter or housing. That will give you your number of bed nights. We do not expect to see more than 182 bed nights per person in a 6-month reporting period. So if we see very high number of bed nights per each person that goes above that 182, we will contact you to find out what the correct number should be. So looking at the GMS, scrolling down to 33, you'll see the type and number of housing units. So in question 32, if we see individuals reported in transitional housing, then we expect to see question 33 and 34 also filled out. If you have only provided emergency shelter with grant funds, then you're going to include just the victim survivors, family members, and bed nights, and you will not be filling out question 33 and 34 because those relate just to transitional housing. So in this instance, you see 2 victim survivors and 4 family members were provided transitional housing for 816 nights. Looking at 33, you'll see those 2 victim survivors were each given vouchers or rent subsidies to be in scattered site transitional housing units. Moving to question 34, because you reported housing vouchers or rent subsidies, we also expect to see that here in housing assistance. So looking at the 5th row down under rent subsidy, you'll see those 2 victim survivors again, and then that's the total cost and number of months rent subsidy was provided for them. If looking at 34, you see there are other various housing assistance types of services that are to be provided. Here you're reporting all of the housing assistance provided to those T housing victim survivors. Moving on to the last section of the victim service section is legal services. So you will report in this subsection only if tribal government program funds were used to provide legal services, whether that be attorneys, paralegals, or specially appointed advocates. You're going to count a victim survivor once for each legal issue addressed. And just a definition for you, a pending matter is one that was open as of the first day of the current reporting period, while a new matter is one that was opened during the current reporting period. Let's look at question 35. For all new and pending matters, report which legal issues tribal government program-funded lawyers, paralegals, or specially appointed advocates were addressed during the current reporting period. There may be multiple issues for each victim survivor. Count a victim survivor once for each legal issue addressed. You may report a victim survivor once for each type of family law matter if more than one was addressed. If you look at 35B, you'll see the various family law matters. 35A and 36 look at number of victim survivors who received assistance with legal issues. Report an unduplicated count for the number of victim survivors who received assistance with at least one legal issue in question 35. If they received assistance with more than one legal issue, count them only once in this question and report them below in question 36. So if you have an individual who received assistance with multiple legal issues, include them in the total for 35A, but then report them again just once in question 36. Question 37 looks at legal outcomes. For all cases closed or issues resolved during the current reporting period for which services were provided by tribal government program-funded lawyers, paralegals, or specially appointed advocates, report the number and type of outcomes for each issue addressed and resolved. Include all outcomes in all matters. You will report the highest level of outcome for the case. Section D2 looks at supervised visitation. So here, if your tribal government program funds were used to provide supervised visitation or exchange services during the current reporting period, you will click yes and fill out this section. If not, you'll skip to section E. 38 looks at the number of families served, partially served, and families seeking services who were not served. So like the victim service section, 38 set up with A, served, B, partially served, and C, not served. Likewise, the question that comes after 38 is 39, which is reasons families seeking services were not served or were partially served. For all the families counted as not served or partially served in question 38, you will report those reasons in question 39. If you check parties not accepted into program as the reason, you must report the number and reasons for non-acceptance in question 39A. So going to the next page, you see 39A, number of families not accepted into the program and reasons. Those reasons are detailed there, and you'll provide the number of families declined for each of those reasons, and that will automatically total. Question 40 looks at the demographic of family members served or partially served. So here you're only looking at served and partially served individuals. You're not looking at not served individuals. If you look at the columns, you'll see custodial parents, non-custodial parents, and children. And you'll provide the race, ethnicity, gender, age, and other demographics, very similar to the victim services section. Question 41 looks at number of families by primary victimization and referral source. So here you're going to report the number of families by their primary victimization type, so going across the top there, and then under the appropriate referral source, so in that first column going down in those rows. This should equal the sum of questions 38A and 38B. Question 42 looks at services provided with tribal government program funds. So these are the types of services. So you'll see group supervision, one-to-one supervision, supervised exchange, telephone monitoring. So here you're going to include the number of families and then the number of times the service was provided. So for instance, if two different families got group supervision and one family got it twice and one family got it 6 times, your response would be 2 families and then 8 times for number of services provided. Question 43 looks at services terminated or completed. For all families served and partially served, reports the number of families that completed or were terminated from the program during the current reporting period. If a family was terminated for more than one reason, you're going to report the primary reason only. If a family did not begin grant-funded services for any reason, they should not be reported here. For example, if a family completed an intake but did not participate in services, that family would not be counted on this form. Or if one party completed the intake but the other did not, that family would not be counted on this form. Question 44 is an optional additional information question. So this is the question you're going to use for any more information you want to discuss about supervised visitation, but also for all the previous victim service sections. So the victim services, shelter transitional housing, or legal services. This is where you will provide additional information about any of those activities. It's just one question for all 4 subsections. Section E1 looks at criminal justice systems. E1 looks specifically at law enforcement. You'll complete this section if your tribal government program grant was used for law enforcement activities. And again, you're only reporting grant-funded activities. If you have an advocate employed by or located at the law enforcement agency, but tribal government grant funds are not supporting law enforcement activities, you're not completing this section. However, if you're funding a prosecution-based investigator, you would report their activities here. So thinking back to previously in this presentation about having the appropriate FTEs for the sections that are filled out, we would expect to see law enforcement FTEs if you're filling out this section. Question 45 looks at the number of law enforcement activities relating to sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking cases or incidents for the current reporting period. You see, here's the list. Question 46 looks at the victim survivor referrals to victim services. So here you'll report the total number of victim survivor referrals made by tribal government program funded law enforcement officers to victim services. You'll also see that they are tribal victim services and non-tribal victim services, so you'll break it out between where they were referred to. And these numbers are not unduplicated since the victim survivor could receive a referral to both tribal and non-tribal services. Question 47 looks at protection orders. Report the total number of temporary and or final protection orders requested and granted. Protection orders should be reported only if grant-funded law enforcement provided assistance to victim survivors. And then finally, question 48 is another optional additional information question where you provide more detail about your law enforcement activities and the effectiveness of those grant-funded activities. Section E2, tribal prosecution. If you use tribal government program grant funds for tribal prosecution during the current reporting period, you would check yes and fill out this section. If not, you would skip and go to subsection E3. Here's some tips for prosecution. If you have an advocate employed by or located at the prosecutor's office, but grant funds are not supporting the prosecution activities, you would not complete the section, but you would report activities in Section D, Victim Services. In this section, report on the cases that a grant-funded prosecutor worked on. Cases should be characterized by the most serious offense and may include numerous charges or counts. In most instances, a case will refer to one victim, one offender, and one incident. For question 49, report the number of case referrals received, the number of cases accepted for prosecution, the number of cases declined, and the number of cases transferred to higher or lower court outside grant-funded jurisdictions. The numbers reported in 49B, C, and D should be related to the number reported in 49A case referrals. There may be exceptions, such as if a case referral was received during the previous reporting period, but no decision was made until the current reporting period. For any cases reported as declined in question 49 Part D, report the reason declined in the following question 49A. So if you look at the slide, you'll see 49A reasons for declining cases, and those possible reasons are detailed there. And again, there is an other in this question, so if none of those reasons apply, then you may include an other. For question 50, we're looking at disposition of cases. Here you'll report the dispositions of those cases resolved during the current reporting period by type of case and disposition. If the case is not yet resolved, you do not need to report anything. For question 51, if other issues were present in a case, you can discuss them here. For question 52, you're looking at number of victim survivor referrals, either to tribal victim services or non-tribal victim services. Again, this does not have to be an unduplicated count, as a victim survivor may be referred to both. Question 53, you're going to report protection orders, both temporary and final, for which victim survivors received assistance from grant-funded prosecution personnel. And then finally, question 54 is another optional additional information question where you can discuss the effectiveness of the prosecution activities or provide more detail. Section E3, tribal courts. If you use tribal government grant funds, you're going to click yes and answer questions 55 through 62. If you did not use grant funds for tribal court activity, then you're going to skip to subsection E4. If you have an advocate employed by or located at the court, but grant funds are not supporting the court activities, you would not complete this section, but you report activities in section D, victim services. For this section, you're going to report by cases rather than charges. Cases should be characterized by the most serious offense and may include numerous charges or counts. In most instances, a case will refer to one victim, one offender, and one incident. Looking at the form, question 55 is looking at number of criminal cases. You're going to report here funds were used for criminal cases. Question 56 looks at the disposition of criminal cases. Here you'll report the disposition of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and or stalking cases resolved during the current reporting period, including dismissals, deferred adjudications, convictions, and acquittals. Question 56 looks at judicial monitoring. If funds were used for judicial monitoring, you would report the number of offenders reviewed during the reporting period and total number of review hearings. 58 looks at dispositions of violations. So here you'll report the number of DV, sexual assault, or stalking cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. The violation does not need to occur during the current reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. Just a note for the entire section, you do not need to fill out the entire section if you're not doing everything in the section. So if you're just doing judicial monitoring for questions 57 and 58, you would fill that out, but you wouldn't need to answer the criminal case questions 55 and 56 if you're not doing criminal casework with your grant funds, and vice versa. You may be just filling out question 55 and 56, but not 57 and 58 because you're not doing judicial monitoring. 59 looks at victim survivor referrals to victim services. So here again, you will report the referrals to tribal victim services and or non-tribal victim services. So again, this does not have to be unduplicated because a victim survivor may be referred to both types of services. Question 60 looks at civil protection orders. Here you'll report the temporary protection orders and final protection orders, both requested and granted. And then 61 looks at criminal protection orders and looks at requested and granted. Question 62 is another optional additional information question. And here you could provide more detail about your grant-funded work. Section E4 looks at tribal probation and offender monitoring. So if you use your funds for tribal probation or offender monitoring, click yes and fill out this section. If not, skip to section E5. Question 63 looks at number of offenders. Here you're going to report the number of new and continuing offenders. This should be an unduplicated count. In the final two columns, report the number of offenders that completed probation without violations and the number completing probation with violations. The total number completing probation should not be higher than the total of continuing and new cases reported in the first two columns. Question 64 looks at monitoring activities. For each type of monitoring activity offenders received, report the number of offenders that received said monitoring activity and the total contacts. Moving on to question 65. 65 looks at the disposition of probation violations. So here you're going to report the number of sexual assault, DV, and stalking cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. The violation does not need to occur during the reporting period, only the disposition. A case may be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. Question 66 looks at victim survivor referrals to victim services. They'll report those referrals to tribal victim services and non-tribal victim services. Again, this is an unduplicated count because one victim survivor may be referred to both. Question 67 is another optional additional information question that you can use to provide more information about the effectiveness of your probation activities or offender monitoring activities. Section E5, Batterer Intervention Program. If you use tribal government program funds for BIP activities during the current reporting period, check yes and fill out this section. If not, skip to subsection F. For question 68, you're going to report offenders in the program. You'll report the number of offenders continuing in BIP from the last reporting period and the number of offenders entering the BIP during the current reporting period. Question 69 looks at outcomes. Here you'll report the outcomes for the offenders that completed BIP, who are terminated from the program, or who returned to the program after termination during the current reporting period. If you use other, please be as specific as possible. If an offender is still in the program, you do not need to report that here. Question 70 looks at length of BIP in weeks. So here you report the number of BIP programs supported with grant funds and the length of those programs. Question 71 is another optional additional information question where you can discuss the effectiveness of grant-funded BIP activities. The final section on the form is the narrative section, section F. All grantees must answer question 72. Question 72 looks at the status of your tribal government program grant goals and objectives as of the end of the current reporting period. All of this must be reported each reporting period because your OVW program manager will pay close attention to this question. This question enables them to monitor the status of your grant goals and objectives. Here you're going to indicate whether the activities related to your objectives for the reporting period have been completed, are in progress, are delayed, or have been revised. All grantees must answer questions 73 and 74 on the January to June report. So while you can answer questions 73 and 74 every period, and we encourage you to do so, you are required to only answer 73 and 74 on the January to June report. 73 looks at the most significant areas of remaining need, and 74 looks at what has tribal government program funding allowed you to do that you could not do prior to receiving this funding. When we pull reports together or use narrative for our report to Congress, these two questions are the narrative questions that we pull most of our quotes out of. So please keep this in mind as you're reporting, because they help guide and inform our reports and also provide real examples that can be used when defending the budget to Congress or when there are data requests and we need more information, more detailed information about the work you are doing and the areas of need that are still not being addressed. Finally, questions 75, 76, and 77 are optional. You're not required to answer these questions, but we encourage you to do so. 75 looks at non-tribal criminal justice dispositions, if you have information about those dispositions. 76, you can provide additional information regarding the effectiveness of your grant-funded program. 76 is another question that we pay extra attention to, especially when we're looking to pull quotes or examples about grant-funded work. In question 77, you'll provide any additional information that may provide explanation about the data submitted. So if you are having trouble with your form in the GMS system and you need to put what we call dummy data in a question just to get the form to validate, here is where you're going to detail that. You would say, we had to put a 99 in question 35 because the form wouldn't validate if we didn't. What we'll do is go look at this question before we look at your data, and if there's something there for us, we're going to be able to clean that data out on our end. So please, if there's anything you want us to know, please provide that information here, because this is where we will look first. Once you have completed your form, you're going to need to validate your form. So if you hit the validate button, there's 3 possible warning signals that will come up. The first is what we call a hard warning. So what this means is that the system thinks there may be an error in your form, and it's going to ask you if you would like to be brought back to the error so it can be reviewed. So if you click yes, you can go review and fix the error. If you hit no, it won't bring you back to the potential issue. However, you also will not be able to validate your form. So we encourage you to hit yes and figure out what's going on so that you can have successful validation. The next warning we call a soft warning. It's the little yellow triangle with the exclamation point. That means that the system thinks there's a potential error with your form, and it's going to ask you to go look at that error or errors. If you click yes, you can go check those out and fix them, and if there isn't an issue, then you will be able to still validate your form. It's just a soft warning to just give you a chance to take a second look before you complete the validation. And then the final warning is not actually a warning at all. It's that your form has been successfully validated and it's ready to be uploaded and submitted in your GMS system. So this slide shows Muskie's VAWA MEI website. Here you can look at sample progress reporting forms or instructions, our training dates and materials. We have our reports to Congress as well as summary data reports available to you where you can look at aggregated data by grant programs, and then any OVW updates on reporting. If you have any questions for us, our general line is detailed here as well as email. If you have any questions for your program specialist, this is the number you can call, and then if you need any technical assistance with your GMS form or getting into your portal, here's the number or email you'll want to reach out to. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this was helpful for you. Again, as I said earlier, if you have any questions or you want to walk through any specific examples or maybe some help calculating your staff FTEs, definitely call us, email us. We are here to help. That's our job, and we want to make this reporting process as easy for you and as understandable as possible because, as we mentioned, the more accurate your data is, the better it is for the reports that we pull together and how we defend the budget for VAWA and all its grantees. Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing from you.